Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on introducing the FAC1, the Framework Alliance Contract. We're just going to give it a few minutes, let people join before we begin. In the meantime, if you do have any issues or anything like that, you could use the chat function to send a message across. If you have any questions, then please use the Q&A button or Q&A feature, and we'll get to those at the end. Thank you.
Somebody raised their hand there. Michael Gilboy.
So if you could just use the chat function for now, and yeah, any issues you have or anything like that, I will attend to.
Farhan, are we recording this? I see it is being recorded. Is the recording going to be released for future reference for those who can't make it?
Yeah, so shortly after this session is done, Zoom will send out a link to the recording, but also we will upload the recording on the past events section of the NEC website, along with the PDF of the slides as well. So both of those will be available after the broadcast.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll begin. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on FAC1, the Framework Alliance Contract. I'm Farhan, the Marketing Executive here at NEC, and I'll be moderating today's session. So if you have any questions or anything like that, please do use the Q&A function today, and Professor David Mosey and Kevin Murray will answer those at the end of the session. And if you have any tech-related issues or anything like that, please use the chat function and I'll be on hand to answer those as well. We're delighted today to be joined by two leading experts, Professor David Mosey from King's College London, who is the principal author of the FAC1, and Kevin Murray, Managing Director of Metre Limited, who has extensive experience delivering major collaborative construction programs. Throughout the session, as I've mentioned, please do feel free to submit your questions, as there will be a Q&A session at the end. And after the session, you'll receive a short post-webinar survey, and we'd really value your feedback on that. It's just 5 questions, so it shouldn't take too long. Finally, if today's session sparks your interest and you'd like to explore how FAC1 works in more depth, we're running a training course on the 4th of December, delivered virtually. It's a great opportunity to dive deeper into practical applications with our experts. You can find out more details and register using the link, which I will share now. So there will be, if you go to the resources section, if you just bear with me, I'm going to find it. And I'll share that so that you can follow that link and register. Now, without further ado, I will hand over to Professor David Mosey.
Thank you, Farhan. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this introductory webinar. We will cover as much ground as we can in the limited time, and I hope it will give the answers to some of the questions in your mind. We're going to look at what FAC1 is, why it matters, and how it works in practice with NEC, and how it operates in action with case study highlights that Kevin Murray will talk through. And there will be some time for Q&A. Farhan will moderate that, looking at the Q&A the questions you'll raise on the chat, please. If I could have the next slide. if I have the next slide, please, Farhan. No, back one. Thank you. We hope that at the end of today's session you'll understand the purpose and the structure and the benefits of FAC1 and how it is distinct from other NEC contracts, and you'll learn how it complements other NEC contracts and see some real-world case applications. And you'll also be able to recognise why FAC1 is fully aligned with the UK government's Construction Playbook, and a report that forms part of that playbook that I wrote called Constructing the Gold Standard. I will refer to that once or twice in my presentation. It is available online, Constructing the Gold Standard, which is a government strategic document for the implementation of infrastructure and construction programs through an engine room, if you like, of strategic contractual engagement, and FAC1 is recognised as an exemplar of that. If I could move on, please, Farhan. The first thing we're going to look at is what is FAC1 and why it matters. If I could have the next slide. Please. This is the Framework Alliance Contract. It's a standard form, and it is now part of the NEC family of contracts. It's been adopted on many procurements already in the UK and other countries, and that total of over £100 billion is accurate and substantiated. And it's a wide-ranging instrument. It can be used to integrate small projects worth just £5 million, or it can be used to integrate very large strategic programs of contractor, consultant, supplier frameworks. For example, Crown Commercial Service, the UK government arm for procurement, has used it on over £60 billion worth of work. It is an integrator for procurement and delivery either of multiple projects in a programme of work or the different parts of a single complex project. And it does that by connecting the different contracts that are awarded to each party. It creates relationships and it creates systems that enable and support the achievement of improved value, risk management and dispute avoidance. Now, before we move on, the question is, why did NEC acquire the FAC1 form of contract and indeed the related TAC1 term alliance contract? Because they've been so successful, is the answer. They've been very successful used in conjunction with NEC project contracts. But in Constructing the Gold Standard, we analysed earlier prototypes of FAC1, which delivered on a series of trial projects an average 18.5% agreed savings, agreed improvements in design, extended warranties, improved safety, new local and regional business opportunities, environmental benefits, employment and skills opportunities, and whole life value. And those trial project case studies are still available online. That is the sort of evidence that supports the benefit of adding an FAC1 integrator to a proven, effective set of contracts in the shape of NEC. And you will hear from Kevin Murray with some more detailed case studies. If we could move on to the next slide, please, Farhan. So this idea of an integrator, it's a concept under Project 13 for enterprise contracting, but it's also a basis for collaboration. What is collaboration if it is not the integration of different interests? And sometimes we struggle to align and integrate the commercial activities of different team members. We know the project or programme of work we're aiming to undertake, but the scope for misunderstandings in those complex interactions is considerable. So FAC integrates multiple NEC contracts. In practice, it has also integrated JCT and FIDIC and PPC contracts. And these are contracts awarded by one or more clients to one or more consultants, contractors, or other providers relating to either a programme of related projects or a programme of unrelated projects. That's a conventional framework role. The components, or can I go back please? The components or phases of a single complex project, and some projects are so large that they are broken down in that way, or if it's awarded by a contractor, the integration of the work of their supply chain members. And there are many contractors who do engage in these strategic relationships with supply chain members, and this has been a proven integrator for them. In the world of digital information management, again, integration is crucial. Of course, the licensing of intellectual property and the understanding of how the different components fit together. FAC1 is an integrator there, and also an integrator of action plans in seeking to achieve net zero. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, we have obviously excellent project management, excellent program management that goes on there, and we have the benefit of a wholly consistent and proven set of NEC contracts. Why do we need FAC1 as well? What is the problem we're seeking to address? It is this, that we have the risk of missed opportunities. What I describe as the groundhog day of lost learning. Brilliant things are done on a project, and then they can be lost if they're not transferable to another project, and that holds back our progress. If we're doing things one project at a time, it really is difficult to motivate innovation and collaborative behaviours if there isn't the prospect of a flow of work and the reward of innovations that inform that entire flow of work rather than just one project. The other problem, I think, in the world of collaboration is vagueness. No, please, vagueness, because we've got one metaphor, the Groundhog Day. The other metaphor is the Bermuda Triangle. We talk about our aspirations to collaborate, but what do we mean? If it's vague, it is vulnerable to cynical criticism and vulnerable to the third part of the Bermuda Triangle, which is unrealized aspirations. We all want to collaborate, but often we expect someone else to change in order to do so. And a clarification of strategic relationships and integration across the different project contracts gives us a lot more clarity to avoid lost learning, to avoid late engagement, to avoid exclusion of key members of the team. That will take us into a world, as is proven, of more innovation and early supply chain input, because the processes are there and the motivation of a workflow is there. It gives us the rigour of measurable improvements from one project or phase to another in terms of cost, safety, social value, net zero delivery. And it gives the application of learning across programs or projects with a clear understanding of intellectual property, how it's licensed, how it's retained, and this idea that we don't have the Groundhog Day of brilliant designs and ideas being lost or kept secret for somebody to use only in their tender for the next project. So we iron out duplication, and by having motivation and clarity, we have fewer disputes. If I could have the next slide, please. Just to unpack FAC1 a little bit, and I'm afraid we can only do it at a light level. I hope some of you do have copies of the contract. I'm talking through some basic clauses here. These contractual systems that I'm talking about, firstly, Clause 1 integrates the roles of the different alliance members because they're all signing a single multi-party contract, and it sets out the individuals who comprise a core group who will undertake decision-making on ideas for improved value and decision-making on trying to avert disputes and manage risk. In Clause 2, all of these alliance members, the client, the alliance manager, the contractors, consultants, suppliers, will agree to pursue specified improved value. And they set out in Schedule 1. Sorry, you've moved on. I need to go back. I'm not sure why you've done that. Can we? There we are. No, we're good. They set out in Schedule 1 measured objectives that are agreed, success measures for achieving those objectives and targets for those success measures, and they link those to agreed incentives. So that is a really important foundation for any strategic relationship, for a major project, for a program for work, for BIM. What are we doing? Why are we entering into these relationships? And how do we measure whether we've succeeded, and how do we disengage if we haven't succeeded. FAC1 also in Clause 5 deals with the awarding of any number or range of project contracts. That's where the NEC contracts come in, and those together comprise the overarching framework programme. And then it describes in Clause 6 a timetable of supply chain collaboration, I will come back to that, and other agreed alliance activities that are designed to meet these objectives. Instead of just awarding the contract and waiting to see whether improvements are obtained and then terminating people if they're not obtained, this is a set of shared machinery for all the parties to move through their relationship, improving value as they go. If I could have the next slide, please. And the other systems in this contract that I want to refer to are early engagement of alliance members and supply chain members in advance of start on site. So that gives you, if you like, the alternative to a letter of intent. Some of you will know the nightmares of letters of intent. Provisional early works in terms of site preparation, in terms of ordering of materials, all of those you have a much greater opportunity to undertake because you're within the strategic contract. Until the NEC contract comes to life on the individual project, early activities are governed by the FAC1 and then are drawn into the NEC contract when it's awarded. It gives flexibility and it gives much needed opportunities for provisional engagement. And then when it comes to innovation, and this is what we want to drive, we know we're an industry full of innovators, we just don't want those innovations to be lost. Where we've got ideas for performance improvement in terms of quality, safety, net zero, cost saving, we want to share those, but we want to protect the intellectual property rights of the parties who created them and their other commercial interests. And that is done through the licensing in Clause 11 and the range of obligations that come with intellectual property rights and the limits on those obligations. And I have to say that is a balanced clause that has been welcomed. The alternative, of course, without a multi-party framework alliance contract is that the poor old client has to manage the intellectual property interfaces between all of the parties it appoints and any breaches of those intellectual property rights, and the main contractor or main contractors each have to manage those rights down the supply chain. The direct licensing is a very important tool for information management in any aspect of a project or program of work. It cuts right through some very, very complicated worries around information management and rights. And then when things do go wrong, as they inevitably do, managing strategic risks. Now, many of you will be very familiar with the early warning systems that are so effective in NEC and the proactive approach to risk. But we're looking at risks at a strategic level before we enter into the NEC contracts, after we come out of them in terms of feedback and learning, and how we can transfer risk knowledge between projects so that issues that have been a difficulty for one team are not only resolved with the support of other teams, but they don't recur on other projects. That is done partly through the early warning system, of course, getting them on the table, and partly through this strategic core group of individuals from each alliance member who have to meet when required to, who reach decisions by consensus of those who turn up at the meeting so that nobody can block the progress of the decision making, and who seek to agree solutions. If they don't, well, other contract provisions apply, but it creates this opportunity to stay on the front foot and to share learning when problems arise as well as when opportunities arise. We've got to have the next slide, please. I hope this is making sense. We come to this issue of using FAC with NEC, and I want to mention very valuable government guidance in the UK, and this is relevant for people who are on this call from other jurisdictions. The UK government published its Construction Playbook and then an update of that in 2022. And as I say, I was commissioned to write for them an independent report on frameworks and framework contracts called Constructing the Gold Standard. And both these documents recognise the potential powerhouse of frameworks to deliver strategic value and continuous improvement and shared learning, their potential to attract investment and to reward it with profit, their potential to create a stable construction industry and flow of work, and therefore their potential to deliver better, safer, faster, greener projects. But not all contracts do that, not all frameworks do that. There has been a tendency certainly to have aspirations. Constructing the Gold Standard said that 100% of the framework contracts I reviewed had aspirations for better value. Only 25% of them had machinery. And this contract is the machinery for achieving improved value. Now, FAC1 is recommended by the UK government in its playbook, and among those who participated in my review, Constructing the Gold Standard, obviously I couldn't mention the contract there, but many of them did, and 57 billion worth of those frameworks were using FAC1. So it's out there among the exemplars of good practice, as indeed is NEC and has been for much longer. It is also recommended by the UK government and well recognised by the industry and clients as a set of contracts that stimulate good management of relationships and create the environment for successful project delivery. So we're not taking anything away from what NEC contracts deliver at project level. We're complementing it with similar effective relationships at a strategic level. So therefore FAC can be applied alongside the NEC 4 contracts to get this practical collaboration across multiple projects or the different parts of a complex project. And also to support, as I mentioned earlier, relationships that are promoted by Project 13. Project 13 is an initiative among a really elite group of clients who've shown a high level of collaboration, but there has not until now been a standard form contract that they can adopt. And it's interesting that the government's Construction Playbook recognised the role of FAC1 as a medium to deliver the aspirations and systems of Project 13. If I could have the next slide, please. So FAC1 does not change the NEC contracts. It amplifies their key features and it makes sure that all the programmes and projects awarded under FAC1 facilitate improved delivery and outcomes. So there's a little diagram there of an umbrella, the multi-party FAC1 Framework Alliance contract, and how it connects and covers the award procedures, the digital technology, the joint activities for seeking improved value, the joint risk management for heading off trouble, the measurement of performance, the success measures and targets to see whether objectives are being achieved and whether incentives are being earned, the integration of design solutions, the potential to standardize and benefit from sharing design knowledge, and the achievement of improved value, which of course is essential. Money is tight, time is limited, demands are considerable, and improved value is not an option, it's a necessity. And out of that multi-party framework alliance contract come a series of project contracts that implement each individual project, and those of course are the other members of the NEC suite. If I could have the next slide, please. So we're going to look next at how FAC1 works in practice with NEC, and then Kevin Murray will come in with a series of case studies that illustrate that approach. If I have the next slide, please. These case studies show how the two contracts work together, and I'm just going to summarize why they are so complementary. FAC1 describes activities that can govern the award of the NEC 4 contracts, that can integrate those contracts, and that can enhance the implementation of the NEC 4 contracts. And the sort of features in FAC1 which fit with NEC 4 include procedures for award, and that's any type of work, services, supply, so that's any of the NEC contracts. Framework level early supply chain involvement, so you know about X22, I imagine, those of you who are NEC users, This framework level early supply chain involvement I'll talk about later, but it really does give motivation to Tier 2, Tier 3 members to share their ideas and to fully participate, because of course they're getting a share of a bigger pie, and they are able to help test designs, consultant designs, test risk assumptions, seek cost savings far more effectively at a strategic level than just on individual projects. Framework level performance measurement and incentives, there's very little benefit in doing performance measurement just within a single project, because what happens next? How does that influence the next project? But in an overarching framework, the measurement of performance can lead to financial incentives, but it also leads to the incentives of additional work, which is hugely important to everybody in the industry. The option to create a digital information management integrator, if digital information management is being used, is very, very important, and we are using a whole range of digital tools at the moment, but grounding them in direct mutual contractual commitments, such as intellectual property, as I mentioned before, as well as effective timetabling and communication of the digital contributions, is as important as it ever was. And then at framework level, early warning and risk management that look at those issues strategically and seek to share solutions and head off difficulties. If I could have the next slide, please. And then looking at it from the other side, NEC contracts already encourage cooperation, but they can also complement FAC1 and enhance its implementation because they fit and because they are focused on the same issues. This works well. So the sort of NEC features we're talking about are, firstly, their consistency across all types of work, services and supplies, supported by guidance, supported by case studies, their project level early supply chain involvement, X22 of course, their project level performance measurement and incentives, their own option to use digital information management, and the highly successful project level early warning and risk management. So you can see that both contracts in their different environments, individual projects, complex projects, multiple projects, are seeking to achieve similar aims, but are weaker on their own and far stronger when used together. If I could have the next slide, please. So we're looking at different activities under FAC1. These are activities that could be undertaken in advance of the NEC contracts, in advance of their being awarded, and in parallel with their performance. What am I talking about here? These alliance activities in FAC1 are described as supply chain collaboration, which I will come to next, innovation and education, exchange of information, integration and adaptation and standardization of roles, expertise and responsibilities. So if you're dealing with different contractors on a related program of work, but you want a consistent set of mechanical and electrical equipment, or consistent cladding, or consistent approaches to other aspects, you have the opportunity under FAC1 to work with the supply chain and to integrate the work of those different contractors to get that standardization, to get that clear integration and adaptation of what they might otherwise assume is required by the client. That's a very simplistic example, and Kevin will bring that to life in a case study shortly. When you go to the NEC4 project contract, clearly that is an agreement between the FAC1 client and one of the other alliance members, using any of the NEC forms for any works or design or other consultancy services or the supply of goods and services, and possibly using at supply chain level, not possibly, definitely using at supply chain level corresponding NEC4 subcontracts. So that's how they contractually are knitted together. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, NEC have had option X12, multi-party collaboration, for some time, but that has never created direct contractual relationships, and it's never spanned more than a single project. So one of the things that we can conclude is that there is no need to use option X12 under an FAC1 framework alliance contract because those NEC contracts are benefiting from the multi-party collaboration that is addressed in FAC1. For example, through the core group, which is managing the interfaces between alliance members. One of the big things that I just want to focus on for a moment is this concept of supply chain collaboration. It sounds like a buzzword, but it is described very clearly in clause 6.3. It is also described in detail in Constructing the Gold Standard with a flow chart in Annex 5 to that document, and it has been proven on multiple projects. And what this does is to say that one client, or indeed multiple additional clients under FAC1, can set out a process where they work with one or more of the other alliance members, the consultants and the contractors, ahead of any project going on site, to review and improve and integrate the appointments of subcontractors. Now, Tier 1 contractors do this all the time. They're creating strategic relationships with supply chain members, but they're not necessarily exploring them with full knowledge of what the client wants and or full knowledge of what consultants are designing. So early supply chain involvement, which is mandated on a comply or explain basis under the Construction Playbook, can be brought to life through this strategic engagement, highly motivational to the Tier 2s because it's more than an individual project, highly motivational to the clients because they get consistency and an opportunity to test in terms of risk, in terms of design, in terms of cost, the implications of supply chain relationships. And on a darker note, if you look at the Grenfell Tower and the need there for design consultants to test proposals with not only a main contractor but the proposed cladding suppliers, it's not the example we care to use every day, but it's a pretty important one, that a strategic process for looking at the full implications of design assumptions and risk assumptions requires engagement not only with Tier 1 contractors but also with the specialists at Tier 2, and if that's done strategically through FAC1, well, we have many examples of it bearing fruit. Those outputs from the process clearly need to be recognised in the relevant NEC for contract scope, and that is exactly how it has worked out. If I could have the next slide, please. And then we come to sustainability and climate change and whole life cost and BIM. And both FAC and NEC are very proactive in those respects. FAC1 provides for consistent processes to be incorporated in each project contract. And that is important. It has a very clear definition of sustainability that has stood up well, but it also looks at not only climate change but whole life cost and building information management. And it looks at how those are addressed and measured and integrated and incentivized and then flowed down into each NEC project contract. That does, for those of you who are regular NEC users, require secondary options to be adopted in the NEC project contracts, such as X10 information modelling, X21 whole life cost and X29 climate change, so that the strategic activities agreed under FAC1 and measured and rewarded at strategic level are reflected in the NEC project contracts and not lost, if you like, once individual NEC projects go on site. And the next slide, please. Okay, this is, I think, my last slide before I hand over on to Kevin Murray to talk about case studies. Timing. Timing is everything. One of the great proven benefits of NEC that changed the construction landscape was its use of the accepted program and real-time programming combined with early warning. But FAC1 does the same thing at a strategic level through a multi-party timetable. This drives the achievement of agreed deadlines and milestones and gateways in the framework program, in the achievement of objectives, and in the timescales for those alliance activities that I described. So when we're planning together, when we're engaging together, when we're seeking to innovate and educate each other, exchange information, pursue standardization, pursue improved value, and indeed head off risks. The timing of those interfaces, including client turnaround time, alliance manager turnaround time, gives a very transparent picture of exactly what collaboration looks like under this multi-party contract. And that works very well in hand with the NEC main contracts and their requirement for a detailed accepted programme put in place in order to achieve delivery of the works to time and to deal with any failures to do so. So again, very much time driven, and yes, where the project contracts involve delivery of part of the FICE1 framework programme, the timescales in both contracts need to align and drive consistent objectives. If I could have the next slide, please. This is my last slide. To summarise, FAC1 is designed to complement NEC and not to replace it. So the NEC operates at project level with scope, time, cost, risk and delivery, and the FAC1 operates at programme level with these shared objectives, incentives, joint risk management, supply chain collaboration. And together they create this integrated system that aligns project delivery with strategic outcomes. And one of the early engagements that NEC undertook was to provide, last year, guidance on using the two contracts together. So my last point, I suppose, is that NEC on its own, of course, gives very strong project governance, but adding FAC1 creates this framework of collaboration with clear parameters, not giving up normal rights, not being vague, not pushing the collaborative obligations onto other parties, but spelling out who is doing what, when they're doing it, and indeed why they're doing it, and how that operates across all NEC projects to ensure consistency, efficiency, and improved value at project and programme level. And on that note, I will hand over, with the next slide please, to Kevin Murray to go into some depth in looking at how this has played out in real life.
Okay, good morning. Thanks, David. If we can go on to the next slide, please, Farhan. Okay, just to reiterate, because the Construction Playbook endorses FAC1, and it is widely used as the following examples will show, with NEC contracts and by adopters of constructing the gold standard. There is a lot of guidance on NEC4 generally, but there is specific guidance on using NEC4 contracts with the FAC1 that was published in June 2024. If you would like further detail on the use of FAC1, there is a handbook that David authored, the FAC1 Framework Alliance Contract Handbook, available on Amazon at £34.13, only 5 copies left, must be a after that, and amazingly £52.90 on eBay. So thoroughly recommend the book for those that are using FAC1. Also, Constructing the Gold Standard NEC guidance, FAC1, all contain case studies of FAC1 used in conjunction with NEC contracts. Also, just mention that in terms of procurement routes, options A, C, and E of NEC4 will work perfectly well under FAC1. So whether it's traditional design and build, integrated project insurance-backed alliancing, NEC4, FAC1 will work in tandem. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Farhan. We start. So there are quite a lot of examples that are listed on this slide. I'm going to go through 5 case studies. One relates to procurements set up by Crown Commercial Service, and then there are 4 project and program case studies. 2 of those 4 use FAC1 and NEC 4. In terms of the examples on the screen now, both Crown Commercial Service and LHC have verified gold standard frameworks, so completely compliant with the Construction Playbook. A couple of more unusual ones on there. Enel Green Energy, they basically undertake renewable energy projects, and ITER fusion power production at power plant level, and both of those are used internationally. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Farhan, just conscious of time. So Crown Commercial Service, I was seconded from Cabinet Office to Crown Commercial Service in 2016 to oversee and procure the implementation of the construction professional services frameworks. And FAC1, it was the first time it was used by Crown Commercial very successfully. The construction professional services was had an overall value in the order of 2 billion. 26 suppliers were appointed to it, and currently the succession of that one, CPS2, is currently out to tender with an estimated value of 3.5 billion. So just to make clear that FAC1 was used instead of the standard CCS framework agreements. Having procured the construction professional services, the construction professional services, the construction works and services frameworks were then procured. The first one had a value of circa 30 billion. There were over 100 suppliers appointed to it across 11 lots. The off-site solutions framework soon followed this, and on the off-site solutions framework, 24 suppliers appointed. There was then a second construction works and services framework procured along with the NHS, procured 24, and currently construction works and services 3 is in the process of going through CCS governance. But again, that is going to be using FAC1 as an enabler for use by government departments to use best practice for projects called off of the frameworks. So in terms of Crown Commercial Service, it clearly collates an awful lot of information and shared learning across a vast range of programs. And some of the more detailed case studies are actually using the Crown Commercial Service Construction Works and Services framework. It's been used for development of information management, supply chain sourcing, making sure there's no bottlenecks, looking at financial distress in supply chains, etc. The other thing that we're very conscious of in terms of cost of bidding for these frameworks was to make sure that boilerplate clauses associated with working for government were consistently used, and that departments and other contracting authorities that use the CCS frameworks didn't produce their own amendments to the contracts for things like confidentiality, intellectual property rights, etc. So under the CCS frameworks, there are Z clauses for the NEC contracts that departments are obliged to use. So 30 billion, the first construction works services framework, CWAS 3, the one that is currently in preparation, ready to go out to tender next year, has a value of circa 80 billion. If we go on to the next slide, please, Farhan. So Ministry of Justice, they've been using alliancing since 2003, and I undertook a procurement review for them of the way that they procured their projects, and with the support of Trowers and Hamlins and fantastic client leadership by what was then the prison service, the department entered into strategic alliances with 8 contractors for new build and 7 contractors for refurb. They were 10-year alliances. Initially, projects were called off on a taxi rank basis for an even spread of work. Those initial strategic alliances delivered over 10,000 prison places. There was significant information sharing amongst the alliance partners, to the point where Interserve were actually sharing the way in which they designed private sector prisons for lower operational costs with what was actually their competitors. So it was a huge step for the prison service MOJ, and one that the market really readily took up and shared that information. The second iteration again used the Strategic Alliance Agreement, which is a prototype of FAC1. That was set up in 2012. MOJ were the lead partners, the lead department in BIM for government, and also in respect of the introduction of lean. They also used project value indicators to make sure that value for money was being achieved. Overall, across the 2 alliances, 26% audited cost savings were achieved. And the integration of the BIM and the MMC is continuing to date, and I'll go into another case study on that shortly. It's been highly successful for the MOJ. So if we then go on to the next slide, please, Farhan, I'll give you a specific project example from the Ministry of Justice. So under the Construction Works and Services framework set up by Crown Commercial Services, Ministry of Justice set up a sub-alliance using FAC1 with 4 contractors, with a view to them jointly developing the design, pricing and supply chain for the construction of 4 new prisons for 6,000 new prison places. There was one designer appointed, Perfect Circle, that worked for all 4 of the contractors. Mace were the delivery partner, who were employed by the MOJ, and WT partnership with the cost consultants, who looked over the way in which the pricing was being conducted and the supply chains were being procured. This model's been very successful. Kier delivered the first prison at Full Sutton. That was handed over earlier this year. It's a 1.2 billion program. Lang are delivering a scheme at Aylesbury, and Waits are delivering a new prison at Gartree. The one well-publicised issue on this was the failure of ISG, who were one of the 4 contractors appointed. But because the supply chains, the designs had all been set up for use by any of the 4 contractors, Lang O'Rourke were able to quickly be appointed to actually take on the supply chain that ISG were going to use for the prison that ISG were going to construct. So huge advances in information management, design for manufacture, absolutely at the forefront of this, particularly precast concrete. And there was also a secondment scheme that Mace operated, where staff from 4 contractors actually gained experience for 8 months in other disciplines with another of the 4 contractors that were engaged in this program. So a really collaborative effort on this one, and it's proven to be highly successful in delivery of this program. If we go on to the next one, please, Farhan. So again, another program that is derived from a Crown Commercial Service framework, this one being the Offsite Solutions framework. So Ministry of Defence recognised that they desperately need to improve the quality of their single living accommodation. It was part of the government's strategic defence review, and in 2024 they announced that 6 contractors would be using would be working together, collaborating on the creation of 16,000 single living accommodation units, with a view to increase resilience for the armed services, to make sure that people weren't actually leaving the armed services because of the poor quality accommodation, achieving net zero, significant offsite manufacture, standardization of design, and consistent standards. Total contract value of over $1 billion, like the prison program, the new build prison program, using NEC and NEC4 as the form of contract for the delivery of each of the single living accommodation unit projects. So moving swiftly on to case study 5, Oxfordshire County Council had a 10-year contract, one of the prototypes for FAC1 with Skanska. Contract has run its full term. There's a number of advantages on the slide. I'm just going to mention a few specifics that were actually delivered. So under the 10-year agreement, 350 local jobs were created over the contract term. There was significant volunteering to help local communities and schools. Investment in plant because of the long-term nature and the collaboration between the client and Skanska. For example, Skanska imported machinery, a dragon patcher, to help reduce the number or to repair potholes, and to make sure that the machinery was kept in full use. Oxford County Council showed great leadership and worked with neighbouring authorities in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough to make sure that the equipment was fully utilised. Another example of the benefits was 19,000 tonnes of tarmac being recycled to repair 10 kilometres of road, 300-tonne reduction in carbon footprint, and a £2 million saving for council taxpayers in Oxfordshire. So, benefit of a long-term relationship, collaborative relationship, very evident. I think I'm just going to finish on client leadership because it is a big thing. CCS showed great leadership in adopting collaborative forms of contracting, as did the prison service and defence and the others on the screen. Oxford, I point out, used the National Highway Transport Survey to make sure that Skanska were offering value for money. And they also showed leadership in terms of making sure that spend was achieved. And that was through membership of the the Midlands Highway Alliance. So alliancing used extensively by Oxfordshire County Council, both with their contractor, but also with neighbouring authorities. So if we then go on to the last slide. So the report issued by Arcadis that fully endorsed the use of more collaborative standard forms of contract, such as FAC1. And just going back to the original point about the Construction Playbook, that standard form framework contracts should be used, and based around the principles that line objectives, success measures, targets, and incentives to enable joint work on improving value and reducing risk. And the FAC1 is clearly a very good example of this, to deliver the priorities and policies that are actually set out in the playbook. We've only got 4 minutes left, so I'll leave it there, and I think we have some questions.
Thank you both for that. Yes, we will now move on to the questions. As we don't have much time, what we'll try and do is I'll try and group together a few questions in, and if possible, we might be able to answer some questions after the webinar as a sort of Word doc or PDF. But the first question we've got here that I'll group together is essentially asking about the differences between the FAC1 contract and the NEC Alliance contract.
Yeah, I mean, there was a question of why have FAC1, why not amend the Alliance contract? The Alliance contract takes a very particular and purist approach to risk sharing. So it's a type of collaborative contract that is for those who want to go in to the all for one, one for all approach. With the greatest respect to NEC, it has had limited take up in practice, I think, because there are parties who are looking for a more sort of mixed market solution. Also, the NEC Alliance contract is for a single project, and it isn't designed to integrate other NEC contracts. It stands on its own. So the NEC approach, declared approach, was, yes, they could have drafted their own by amending and developing their framework contract, by amending and developing the Alliance contract, but they took, I think, a very collaborative decision in saying, well, FAC1 has been around for a number of years, it works very well with NEC, why would we start again? Why would we not adopt a proven workable form that clients and industry are happy with and that government recommends? And as I say, that was the first step in the guidance. Then they acquired the rights in the contract, and I think that is a pragmatic approach, because of course people are becoming very familiar with using the machinery of the two contracts together.
Thank you. We have another question just on the scale of the projects that are compatible with FAC1. So is the £5 million value for small projects a minimum value, or is it as an example figure? And someone else was asking about a scale between 10 to 100K as a project.
Kevin, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. Yes, when I was working for Justice, the actual project values called off under the Strategic Alliance, which, as I mentioned, was the prototype to FAC1, ranged from 50,000 up to 200 million. I mean, it was a huge range of projects. But because of the collaboration, the pipeline of work that was going through the alliances, the alliance members, the actual contractors and the consultants who were actually appointed to those alliances were quite happy with undertaking a very wide range of project values and project types. So I don't think there's any particular lower or upper value on how AFC1 may be utilised successfully, and it's definitely borne out. I mean, the Ministry of Justice have been using collaborative forms now for 22 years, and really for them the results speak for themselves.
Thank you. We have hit the 12 o'clock mark now, so we will have to draw the webinar to a close, I'm afraid. However, yes, I can see there are still loads of questions left in the Q&A section. So what I'll do is I'll export those out and send that over to Kevin and David, and they will answer them in text form, and we will upload them on the past events section of the website. Before we do go, there are a few next steps. So I've shared that in the resources tab. It should have popped up just as I started the Q&A there. We have the training on the 4th of December. That's virtual training. Please do register for that, sign up for Book Now. If you want a more in-depth analysis of the FAC1. There's also some follow-up webinars. We've got another webinar next month that is on assuring equipment costs under the NEC 4. And guidances, case studies, all those resources are available on the website. I've shared the older NEC 4 guidance document on working with FAC1 that was released last year. But there's also, as mentioned before, Dave, the handbook authored by David Mosey available as well.
Can I just say, for those who've raised questions about highways, the case studies are in there. For those who've raised questions about civil law jurisdictions, there are case studies in there from Italy and Spain.
Thank you. Yeah. So, yeah, and all I can say is thank you so much, everyone, for joining. That was, and to our speakers, Kevin and David, that was a very engaging session. And we hope to see you again for the next one.
Thank you very much.
Very much.
Thank you.